I think we're good to go. Correct? Fantastic. We are back for our second webinar and our second try at getting this correct. Unfortunately, you're dealing with a CEO that is not very good with Gil. I apologize. My name is Adam, and I'd like to welcome you to the Israel Innovation Fund's third webinar with our second one with Gil Troy on the topic of Zionism in the age of Corona. Now, the Zionist movement was the national liberation movement of the Jewish people that not only provided a sense of confidence and strength to a generation in the diaspora that never had it before, but it also answered questions on the I versus the we and the we versus the I. And with what the global community is going through right now, we're asking a lot of questions about the we and the I because we're spending a lot of time with only ourselves in quarantine. There's no more prevalent topic right now than the one that Gil is going to be discussing. So Gil Troy, who needs no introduction because we introduced him last time. I'm so sorry to make you do your intro again, but here is Gil Troy and the question of Zionism in the age of Corona. Gil, I leave the floor to you once more.
Thank you, Adam. And thanks for inviting me back. You know, they say, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. So if you're, I'm sorry, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So right now, those of you who, like Adam, we're going to hear a second lecture in a week. The burden is on you if you fall asleep. This lecture is a standalone, but it's also related to last week's lecture. Last week, we were talking about, on Yom HaAtzmaut, the miracles, the 7 miracles, the 7 phenomena, the 7 extraordinary gifts to Jewish history that the Zionist movement gave. Jewish sovereignty, Jewish democratic, the linguistic revival, the revival in the diaspora. And that's part of the baseline that we'll be talking about today. But today we want to go a little bit more conceptual, and we want to be asking what are some of the core Zionist ideas that shaped Israel, that continue to shape Israel, and that are relevant today, and put it through the lens of a challenge that we've been dealing with already in the Zionist movement for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and is particularly sharpened, as Adam was saying, during these last couple of months of the Corona crisis. And that is this: Zionism was a movement of us. Zionism was a movement of we. Zionism is a movement of collective power, national power, nationalism. And yet we live in a world of the me, the my, the more, the now. And now we're living in a world of social isolation, of cutting off from others, or only doing it, only connecting virtually. And so what I want to do today is ask this question of what does it mean to be a movement of us during a time of I, and a movement of we during a time of me. And we're going to go to a PowerPoint, or is the anxiety-provoking part of the lecture, to see if we can get the technology moving. And we're gonna start with a little perception game. So first you're asking the question of how does a movement about we work at a time of me? And this is a perception game which unfortunately we need to ask again and again whether or not we're in a Corona crisis, which is, which Israel do you see? Do you see an Israel of Jew against Jew? Do you see an Israel of Israeli versus Palestinian? Do you see an Israel of constant conflict? That is the Israel the media shows us. That is the Israel, I'm sorry to say, too many of my friends on the left and on the right only see and only connect to. There's a kind of trauma around Israel where my friends on the left are so busy jumping from a state of outrage to a state of outrage about every outrageous thing this state has done, as described by the New York Times, the BBC, or the CBC, that even on Yom HaAtzmaut, they couldn't celebrate. They had to look at everything through the Palestinian lens. And unfortunately, my friends on the right have become so defensive that they too are so busy defending Israel that they also often forget to have joy. But they also have a tendency sometimes to go to the opposite extreme, and they ignore any of the problems, any of the complexity, and they give us a Israel of Hava Nagila flowers and blue and white dancing and folktales. Our challenge, like all good nationalists, like all good patriots, like all good critics, is to see the good and the bad, to appreciate the miracle of the good, and also to ask, how do I solve whatever problems there are? And how do I make sure that whatever bad there is becomes good? Now let's just take a quick look at some of the things that are going on in Israel these last couple of weeks, although we should point out that this week things are lightening up. But Israel, like so many other countries around the world, has been in shutdown. The El Al terminal, which is infamous for its long lines and its chaos. Okay, it was in the 70s and in the 80s and the 90s. It's now much better, but it's still always so alive and so vital, is now a ghost town. It was a very powerful image of the Knesset hopefully being sterilized, not just against coronavirus, but against all the negative vibes and maybe the egotism. This is one of the many press conferences we've been seeing with the Prime Minister for life. With Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his outgoing health minister and various health experts, of course. This is the broader challenge of the age of lockdown and the age of sterility. There's been some happy notes, some excitement about the fact that little Israel is one of the countries that's out there on the cutting edge, coming up with tests and vaccine possibilities. And every day it seems there are more headlines being generated about the possibilities. And notice also how lovely that it's done also in the context with Israel's Teva, a company which has been limping along financially. Nevertheless, in March when this story came out, thinking about if we do have a potential cure, we're not doing this for money. We're doing this for humanity. And it's something we can be so proud about. And this is one of the various plane loads of Israeli tourists and backpackers that were rushed back home as the crisis grew and grew. And this is one of the many, many health workers from around the world, in this case, Israeli health workers who have been so heroic and have been so important in this fight. They really are the frontline soldiers in this extraordinary fight. And this is a reminder that, of course, Israel is a country of 80% Jews and 20% others, mostly Arabs, mostly Muslim Arabs, and the challenges of making sure that that population is also well protected and well cared for. And this is one of many, many, many things like this that we're doing, the Zooming, and that sense of virtual community. How real is it? What's going on? And inevitably, some humor. So this is a fake page of Talmud. This is a real page of Talmud, and it's called HaCholeh, the sick one, and it's a kind of mock version of the Talmud, asking Talmudic questions about how one deals with sickness. And one of my favorite memes that was popping around, my translation from the Hebrew, we'll survive Corona no problem. But our poor great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, once a year, they're gonna have to be locked down in their houses for 2 weeks, only eat canned foods and sing songs of praise to the Lord from words scrolled on toilet paper as part of the Corona holiday. Of course, making fun of how we ritualize memory and how powerful it is. And of course, many of you saw this Seder plate with Corona beer and thermometer, toilet paper, Purell, etc. Now, the truth is that we could go through that slideshow for Spain, for Italy, for the United States, and find all kinds of parallel stories. This is on the one hand a global story. On the other hand, it has a Spanish accent, an Italian accent, an Israeli accent. What I want to do now is put Corona aside, put those images aside, and think a little bit about what Zionism means today, and think a little bit about this movement of us during this time of I. And then we'll go back and look at some of those same images through clearer glasses, through blue and white lenses, through the story, the ideological story I want to tell about what Zionism means to me. And I offer this really not as the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, although I am in Jerusalem, I offer this as my take, my understanding, my exploration, my Zionist journey, my Jewish journey, my human journey. And it starts with the I, the power of the I, the power of the ani, autonomy. What's more important to all of us who are liberals? And while I don't know every person on the call, I know that all of us as part of the Western story, all of us as part of the Jewish story, have a strong commitment to our own individual stories, our own individual selves, our autonomy. And for a moment, we're not only going to put Corona aside, we're not only going to put Israel aside, we're not only going to put Judaism aside, we're going to think more broadly. And I'm going to tell you a story about, right now, a very well-known author named Jonathan Haidt, and the story that he tells in his extraordinary book, The Righteous Mind, about being a graduate student at the University of Chicago, having studied at the University of Pennsylvania. So good, high-powered, Ivy League superstar, is now studying cultural anthropology and cultural psychology, and goes off to India. And he describes himself as a good liberal atheist. I'm reading the book, didn't know anything about him, but it's obvious that he's a good liberal atheist raised in a suburban Jewish household in Westchester. And he's in India as an anthropology student, trying to understand their customs. And he has a problem. On the one hand, he says, I like these people. He likes to call, he talks about your tendency to like people or dislike people as your elephant. He says, my elephant goes toward them. But on the other hand, I'm a little put off by all their primitive rituals. I'm a little bit put off, even though I think of myself as an open-minded liberal atheist. I think of myself as such an open-minded cultural anthropologist trying to learn from them. And I'm reading all these books and articles by other Westerners who came and wanted to learn from them, but they're sexist. They send women away from the table anytime anything interesting is or important is being discussed. They have all kinds of bizarre rituals which seem to occupy too much of their time. They're not enlightened like me. And he also uses the word autonomy because he's read an article by his dissertation advisor, Richard Schrader from the University of Chicago, who talks about how human beings have certain ethical pillars. And almost everybody, especially, as I said, almost every Westerner has the pillar of autonomy, the me. And in Zionist terms, now I'm jumping for a second, someone like Ruth Gavison warns that all too often the me today leads us to becoming what we call a thin person. The focus so much on the me, the my, the more, the I, leads us to have a thinness, not a thickness. And she suggests that having a thick personality, thick sociology, a thick life, affiliations with particular groups gives us foundational missions. And Gavison and Schrader connect because Haidt says, I get it. Okay, I get the autonomy. But one way he's able to kind of work through his issues with his Indian friends is Richard Schrader says, you not only want autonomy, you also want community, connectedness, and you also want sanctity. And then Richard Schrader helps Jonathan Haidt understand what's going on. Haidt says, yes, I'm a man of thinness. I'm a liberal atheist. I'm someone who focuses so much on the self and on the body as a plaything, as a playground. But now I'd read that article, but now that I'm in India and I'm trying to figure out why I like these people, but I dislike their customs and I'm trying to like their customs, I realize, oh my goodness, all those rituals, all those customs are props. They're props to help people connect to community. And they're props to help these people find some sense of sanctity, some sense of meaning in their life. And if we think of those three, autonomy, community, and sanctity, and then apply them also to the Jewish conversation, to the Zionist conversation, to the Corona crisis conversation, we see a translation of that. The great playwright David Mamet says a remarkable thing, real life consists in belonging. That he only really feels alive, he says, when he's on a movie set or working with a play. He only feels alive, he says, when he's connecting with people, working with people, belonging to something, being bigger than the I, being a part of an us. And the great Israeli poet, the first Mizrahi winner of the Israel Prize in Poetry and Literature, the poet Erez Biton, says something very profound. When he's trying to understand the state of Israel, he says, it's the institution that allows us to create a society based on justice, on generosity, on mutual engagement. Israel becomes the platform for fulfilling our commitment to perfect Israeli society, to repair our community, including each and every one of us on our own path. And you see here in that final sentence, he's playing with the I and the us, the community and the individual, but also the is and the ought. Not saying Israel's perfect, but saying that this can become the platform connecting to traditional ideas, biblical ideas, and modern ideas for trying to make the world a better place by first making our place a better place. And divinity, sanctity, that third dimension of Richard Schrader, who better to be our guide than someone like Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who writes a kind of Walt Whitman-esque poem, Bracha. It's now known as the Song of the Self, also known as the Fourfold Prayer. And he says, there's a person who just sings the song of the self, the I, autonomy, liberal atheism. He finds everything, his complete spiritual satisfaction within himself. How many people do we know like that? How many millennials? Not by me sitting in judgment on them, but self-report in so many studies about an isolation, a loneliness, an alienation, what Emil Durkheim called an anomie, because the self is so powerful that it's sometimes hard to connect to others. But Cook continues. There's also a person who sings the song of the nation. He steps out of his private self. He finds too narrow, too insufficiently developed. And his language was he, yearns for the heights. He stretches, he clings with a sensitive love to the entirety of the Jewish nation and sings with it its song. He shares in its pain, is joyful in its hopes, speaks with exalted and pure thoughts regarding its past and its future, investigates its inner spiritual nature with love and a wise heart. You see also, we're going as Biton goes, from the I to the us, from the individual to the other, from the self to the selflessness, from individual power to collective power. But Cook goes further, because for him, nationalism isn't a way of simply building walls. It's also a way of soaring, of reaching higher, of helping humanity. There's a person whose soul is so broad that it goes way beyond the border of his nation. It sings the song of humanity. The soul grows constantly broader with the exalted totality of humanity in its glorious image. He yearns for humanity's general enlightenment. He looks forward to its supernal perfection. From this source of life, he draws all his thoughts and insights, his ideals and his visions. Now, if we look at the nationalist and the internationalist / cosmopolitan / universalist, if the nationalist sometimes might be so connected to his or her story, his or her country, that they forget others, the super spiritualist here might be cut off from reality, or also might become, as Mama Troy warned, so open-minded, your brains fall out. Don't you need some connectedness? Don't you need some rootedness? And so Cook, pushing us even further, says there's a person who rises even higher until he unites with all existence, with all creatures and with all worlds. And although he sings, this is the person who's engaged in the chapter of song every day. He's assured that he's a child of the world to come. And this is the key. We live in a world of either or. Oh, is it autonomy in Schrader's terms? Or is it community? Or is it sanctity? Liberal atheist. Hyper xenophobic nationalist. Flower child universalist. What Cook and Schrader and Jonathan Haidt realized in India, say, no, no, no. There's a person who rises with all these songs together in one ensemble. So they all give forth their voices. They all sing their songs sweetly. Each supplies its fellow with fullness and life. I get something from my individualism. I get something from my communalism. I get something from my nationalism, and I'm not afraid of that word. I get something from my universalism. I get something from my spirituality. It's a voice of rejoicing and tunefulness. It's a voice of merriness. It's the voice of holiness. And so Rav Kook ultimately gives us a deeply Zionist, a deeply Jewish, but also a deeply humanist vision, which echoes with Haidt and Schrader. The song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity, the song of the world. They all mix together in a chorus with this person, with the fully integrated, fully balanced person at every moment and at all times. So again, Schrader, and look, one of my favorite titles of his is Why Do Men Barbecue, right? He's an anthropologist trying to understand that thing. Adam, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about that. Those who will never be caught, some men, not enlightened men, who won't be caught dead in the kitchen. This is a book from 20, 30 years ago, always wanted to necessarily assert their primitive caveman power through the barbecue. And I like his notion of recipes for cultural psychology. What makes us tick? So his recipe is autonomy, community, and divinity or sanctity. Just be fair, Jonathan Haidt builds on those three and builds a more six-dimensional one, but for the purposes of a lecture, it's very hard to remember all six. So we'll put that aside. Just had to be a nerdy academic and acknowledge Haidt's contribution. And we had, of course, the beautiful, integrated Zionist, Jewish, humanist, Song of the Soul, Song of the Nation, Song of Humanity, Song of the World. Stop. Cleansing breath. One approach to Zionism, a ladder of approaches, right? And here's the danger. I'm choosing that word ladder on purpose. Is it a ladder? Are we saying, oh, well, the higher up you go in Rav Kook's language, you're getting to a hierarchy? Or go back to Erez Biton's beautiful word. It's not a hierarchy, it's a platform. And this platform has many different dimensions, has many different windows, has many different facets. This is the kind of Zionist conversation we need. I'm less interested in where any one of you stand on the Palestinian issue or on the Kotel issue. I don't want to always be talking about Israel through that lens. I'm really interested in opening up a conversation about where we all stand in this search for platforms that give us meaning. And yeah, maybe what is our ladder? What's your ladder? What's my ladder? And now another take. By the way, Hillel Halkin was the star of my Seder. We read this text, small Corona Shrunk Seder this year, my wife, my daughter, and I. And it helped us bounce out of the house. A great adventure, he says, talking about Israel. I wouldn't have exchanged it for the world. There's been nothing like it in human history. An ancient people loses its land, forgets how to speak its language, wanders defenselessly for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. And with its world, with its God and the word and the sacred books. And what does it meet up with? Hatred and persecution and violence and dispossession and banishment. But it refuses to give up. It refuses to surrender its faith. It continues to believe that one day it will be restored in its land, and it manages in the end, by dint of its own efforts, to gather itself from the four corners of the earth and return there, and learns that language. Here, by the way, are some of the 7 miracles we talked about last time. Learns again to bear arms and defend itself. Goes back to homes, wrenches it from the old homes and builds new homes. Entrenches itself there, builds, repulses the enemy surrounding it, grows and prospers in the face of all that happened. Could it have been imagined? Would anyone have believed it? What a miracle. We sometimes, and often the further away from Israel you are, the more you do get so bogged down in the problems, so bogged down in the headlines, that we forget to kind of pinch ourselves and say, wow, what a miracle. And by the way, in his text, Halkin goes a little bit further and says, I couldn't be a bystander to this. How could anyone be a bystander to this? And that's his explanation of why in the 1970s, when Israel was a much tougher place, we didn't have the lovely wines on the vine that Adam and his people celebrate and drink. We didn't have all these cultural activities. We didn't have poor Hillel Halkin didn't have a shot in the heck of making a serious salary. But nevertheless, he says, how could I not be a part of this amazing adventure? Another angle, so you see what I'm doing? I'm trying to give us, as I said, Zionist lenses. So one was the Schwader, autonomy, community, sanctity, vision, with David Mamet's Real Life Begins with Belonging, Erez Biton's idealistic power from that, Ruth Gavison's warning of not to be thin people, but to be thick people with all kinds of affiliations. And then Rav Kook taking the song of the self in so many different ways, the song of the I, the song of the us, the song of the heavens, the song of the earth. And think of these four mems before we go back to Corona. The first, 4 pillars of Zionism: tradition, Masoret. We want to be a part of something that's greater than yesterday, that's rooted in centuries, and in our case, in millennia. And the homeland, the moledet, becomes, again, Erez Biton's word, the platform, or perhaps the screen on which we can project all kinds of different ideas and test them. Project all kinds of values and test them. It's very easy to be idealistic and ethical when you have no power. But to come back to the homeland and live it 3D, live it 24/7, live it 365 days a year, that takes the tradition, that takes the Masoret and brings it alive, whether or not you live in Israel or not, whether or not you live in Israel. Wherever you are, if you're part of this Jewish journey, you're connected. And it can't just be, and this is, you know, hear it in Biton, and you hear it in Rav Kook, and you also, if you hear really carefully, you hear it in Mamet and Gavison too. There has to be an ethic to it. There has to be musar to it. We have Masoret, we have Moledet, we have Musar, we have the sense of value. American nationalism, Jewish nationalism, i.e. Zionism, they're not passive tools. They're not xenophobic, I hate you vehicles. Some people might distort them as such, but they are deeply wired to be idealistic, deeply wired to want to fix the world, deeply wired and democratically wired to want to be expansive and soulful. And finally, we have mishpacha, the sense of family, the sense of connectedness, which I think those of us who've been in Israel over the last couple of weeks, months and years, but certainly this last Corona period, we felt that sense of mishpacha, even if it's through Zoom, even if it's from our window. And so that's another way of thinking about this story. And what I'm really trying to do is go, for those of us who live in the diaspora, from a diaspora Zionism, which simply asked you to help out, to an identity Zionism, which also asks, how does helping Israel help me? Or more than that, how does having the kind of relationships, the kind of interactions, the kind of connectedness that Adam and David Azoni and Hillel Silverman and the whole team of the project are working together to build, to have a back and forth. And so Jonathan Sachs says the Israel of continuity must become Jewry's classroom, the diaspora's ongoing seminar in Jewish identity. Once Israel saved Jews, in the future it will save Judaism. And the immediate question is less whether Jews are at home in London or Jerusalem than whether they are at home in their Jewishness. And Israel becomes a platform, a framework for doing that. And by the way, my vision of identity Zionism isn't just limited to the diaspora. The diaspora, if you'll indulge me in one of those awful light bulb jokes, which I might have told last time, but it's worth, it bears repeating for those of you who didn't hear it. How many gurus does it take to change a light bulb? Trust your inner light. How many therapy patients does it take to change a light bulb? You can only change if you want to change. How many men does it take to change a light bulb? One, he holds the light bulb and assumes the world revolves around him. How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. Sorry, I had to make fun of men and women at the same time. How many Zionists does it take to change a light bulb? 5. 1, to screw the light bulb in. 2 more to go singing and dancing. We've returned to history. We've come back to build and be rebuilt. A 4th, to write the check. And a 5th, to complain about the media coverage. Once upon a time, diaspora Zionism was only about 4 and 5, writing the check and complaining about the media coverage. My vision of identity Zionism is no. For us in the diaspora to ask the question of what does this Israel mean to me? What do I get and give? And what's the back and forth? And that identity Zionism also has to be relevant here in Israel. That it's not just political. It's not just voting. But it's also a deeper ideological question of Masoret, tradition, of Moledet, homeland, of Musar, our ethic, of Mishpacha, and of course, autonomy, sanctity, and community. These are ideas that I've been working out in my recent book, The Zionist Ideas, and through also, we've had over 200 Zionist salons, these kind of conversations, usually more interactive. You can speak to people and it can be more intimate, not virtually. And a new book of mine that's coming out with Natan Sharansky in September, and my publisher tells me I have to say that you can now pre-order it on Amazon, and every pre-order is a vote for the Amazon salespeople to order more and more. So please vote early and vote often, as they used to say in Chicago. If part of the conversation is to have rich Zionist ideas about Zionism, which, as I keep on emphasizing, are about us as Jews, about us as Jewish nationalists, Zionists, and also is about human beings. The powerful story of Natan Sharansky is that no matter where you are, you could be alone in the gulag, isolated, with the KGB telling you again and again, you're abandoned, you're forgotten, but you know that you're truly never alone if you're connected to this extraordinary people called the Jewish people. Does this mean we're better than everybody else? No, of course not. It's not a recipe for arrogance. It's a recipe for connectedness. And I'm just not creative enough to make up my own religion or nation or combination. And I'm lucky enough to be born into this one. So why not build these ideas and build these ties? So now when we look at our earlier slideshow through these ideas, all of a sudden, when we see this picture, we start thinking of Hillel Halkin and Theodor Herzl and Altneu, old and new. Look at the Jerusalem stone. Look at the sense of, yes, it's locked, but also there's something expansive and there's something miraculous. And El Al, the whole notion that we have a Jewish state and a Jewish national carrier and Jewish tourism is part of the miracle. And here, think of the contrast. Look at the symbols of Jewish sovereignty, of Jewish democratic sovereignty versus the people in exile. That, again, I could find a symbol of the United States Congress being cleaned, and it would resonate with American history. But this resonates with Jewish history. I see it through this lens, not to be narrow, but actually to find deeper meaning and to see the roots underneath this moment and to see the power of this moment. And when I see these 4, yeah, I could be a little bit frustrated that we had a health minister for so many years who isn't that sophisticated health-wise. But I see 2 men without kippot, and again, I acknowledge that it's all men in this picture, but that's the current leadership. I see 2 men who look more traditional, 2 men who look more modern, but all of them look proud and strong and free in a way that the traditional Yid didn't. And I also know for a fact that everybody talks about secular versus religious, dati neged chiloni, and here, sorry, we have this image of the kibbutznikim, the chalutzim, who were so secular, and yet every single one of those 4 people had a seder, and the numbers show that 80% of Israelis this year and in previous years had seders, so that things are maybe not so much in boxes. And when I look at this picture, all of a sudden I go, hey, wait a minute. First of all, sovereignty, Jewish flag, the echo of the talit, the linkage between the Jewish world and Jewish story and the national story, but also American Friends of Magen David Adom. That we in Israel, even when we're zeroed in, when we're cut off, when we're putting people who arrive from abroad in 2 weeks of isolation, are never alone. And we're blessed by the charity, the tzedakah, the gifts of others, the wines on the vines. And here, we flip it around and we see that we not only get, but we give. There's an idealism in Startup Nation and the miracle of Startup Nation that we're no longer just the kibbutz. So you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to take these moments and yes, say there's something humanistic about it. There's something universalistic about it. But there's also something deeply Israeli about it, something deeply Zionist about it, something that pushes us outside of our isolation, outside of our selfishness, outside of our self-absorption, to thinking historically, thinking three-dimensionally, thinking more broadly. And when I see the story of Israel doing all that it could to bring back so many of its young people who are backpacking, I also see it through the lens of the Entebbe story and see it through the lens of no Jews being left behind. And that famous moment in 1976 when Israeli commandos led by Yoni Netanyahu flew thousands of miles away to bring Jews and Israelis home. And that story of those two medical workers is brought to alive. And again, we see the American Friends of Magen David Adom. One of them is Dati, a Jewish religious guy. One of them is a Muslim religious guy. And notice how in this now iconic photograph, they prayed simultaneously, separately but together, connected but also particularistic. Their Song of the Self, if we go back to Rav Kook, was one very strongly within their nation, within their religion, but also connecting spiritually in so many profound ways. Right? Think of these two images through Rav Kook's Walt Whitman-esque idea. Think of it through the image of Richard Schrader and autonomy and community and sanctity. These two very powerful, very proficient, very skilled individuals were also giving back to the community and also being connected spiritually. So we see autonomy, community, and sanctity. And look at these numbers. With about 20% of Israeli Arabs, with about 20% of the Israeli population being Israeli Arabs, 17% of Israeli physicians are Arabs, 24% of his nurses, and 40% of his pharmacists are Arabs. Is there more work to do on equality and fighting bigotry in Israel? Of course. But has there been tremendous work done? Absolutely. And here we see the happy story of Israel mobilizing. Again, has it gotten it right perfectly? No, but has there been tremendous cooperation? And is there a hope that perhaps this kind of cooperation and the quiet that there's been on the Gaza border, as Israel secretly helps Hamas, may be the opening to a new Middle East? Who knows? And another, but an unfortunate point also is that amidst all that good, we still have the fundamental problem that Zionism wanted to solve of anti-Semitism, not only alive, but in some ways made worse in these recent days, with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism feeding one another. And ugly images like this with a Trojan horse, the evil Jews are spreading through the COVID-19 bacterium. And I think one of my favorite, even more favorite than the other meme, also from Hebrew, which I translated. Your ancestors fought the Nazis. They paved the roads. They drained swamps. All you need to do is wash your hands, keep your butt on the couch, and watch Netflix. Do you think you can handle that? Who are we as a generation? Of course, I call us the torchbearers. We're not spoiled. And all of a sudden now, well, again, everybody's zooming all over, and there are all kinds of groups. The groupiness of the Jews, never alone. Community, sanctity, autonomy, takes on, again, not a better than everybody flavor, not an arrogant flavor, but its own unique, distinct accent. And to finish up, sometimes it's ideology, sometimes it's sociology, sometimes it's sheer geography and economy. But there's something to be said about the fact that 77% of people in the United States live in houses, 20% live in apartments. And in Israel, 33% live in 3-bedroom apartments, 28% in 4-bedroom apartments. It's almost the exact same number. 79% are in apartments, and 70 versus 77%. 79% of Israelis are in apartments, and 77% of Americans live in private homes. I versus us. Not better or worse, but different. And what does that mean? And with that, I invite your questions, your comments, your feedback, and your conversation, both through this medium, but also feel free to send emails to me at giltroy@gmail.com, and let's continue this conversation about who we are and who we can be. Thank you. Not hearing you, Adam.
My apologies. I was muted. I said, Gil, that was absolutely fantastic. You touched on so many different things. You brought up Durkheim, Walt Whitman, Rob Cook. I mean, like, you really brought out the big guns for this talk, and I greatly appreciate it. We actually, believe it or not, we had one viewer from Abu Dhabi watching this talk, which was very cool for all of us when we saw that happen. And we've got a couple of questions. One is from Richard Summers. And I'll just say this, we had people from all over Israel and North America watching this. There's even somebody from Europe on there. I think the coolest thing is somebody from Abu Dhabi. But Richard Summers wants to know, is it really possible to have a multi-faith discussion in a period of social commitment that's only limited to 120 symbols?
Look, this is our challenge. You know, this whole thing, I mean, it goes back to the Hillel Halkin quote, that if we accept the limits of what is, if we accept the is and don't think of the ought, we're toast. So absolutely, look, I suffer from what I call the world of Twitter dumb, D-U-M-B. And if we reduce everything to a punchline, then yes, we have to be extremists. We have to be either nationalists or universalists. And by the way, I'll say to my friends all over the world, including in Abu Dhabi, that the model of Zionism that I'm trying to articulate here is a model of constructive nationalism that we all need. We all need our own particular regional accents, our own personal national accents, and we also need a kind of collective sense of healthy, constructive, liberal nationalism. So I do tweet. I was resistant to it, but eventually I realized that, you know, even for this talk, I tweeted out the fact that we're having this talk. So I do play the game of 120 or 240 characters, but I also write my 900-word column in the Jerusalem Post every week, which is a great privilege. And more than that, I write big, thick books. And more than that, as you can see, I talk. So our challenge is not to be so, it's again, what I'm trying to see is a kind of, it's what I call a jujitsu, J-E-W. You take the negative, turn it into a positive. So you take some of the negative and some of the positive and then the negative. So I want to live in the modern world. I want to be a part of Facebook culture. I want to be a part of Twitterdom, but I don't want to be defined by it. And you know what? Let me put it on my American political historian hat. One of the things we saw in the 2020 Democratic primaries is that if you only defined the Democratic story through the Twitterverse, the Twitterdom, you would have assumed that we'd have a ticket of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, or Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. But the Main Street still speaks. The people still spoke, and they said, we don't want that. We don't want the extremists. There's so much lazy journalism these days where somebody quotes 5 tweets and actually shows a screenshot of the tweets and says, oh, that's the conversation going on. It's not the conversation going on. And I invite you, my friend Richard, and I invite you, my friend Adam, and I invite all of us on this call to not be limited by what they want us to say and what they want us to fit into, but by our souls, which is Rav Kook teaches us, aren't so easily shoved into buckets, but are expansive and yearning and dreaming. Back to you, Adam.
Our next question is from Michael Graff. He would like to know, do you think there is any representation of this kind of Zionism that is open and has lenses? Is that the state of in the state of Israel today? I would ask the question: is that the state of Israel today? And if not, how do we Israelis, as Israelis, create it? So I guess you could sum it up: do you feel that the version of Zionism that you're discussing is prevalent today in Israeli society? And if not, how do we enhance that or create it or permeate that in society?
Thank you for that, Michael. And hi. First of all, I'd say some of the things that you're doing when you invite me to speak to a group of young people who want to learn during the Corona lockdown about American history while living in Israel. That kind of cross-cultural celebration is going on in Israel every single day. Do I see it in the Israel of the headlines? Absolutely not. Do I learn about it in the school curriculum when I watch my kids learn? Unfortunately, not enough. But do I see it and live it every day? Absolutely. And one of the things I've been trying to do with my book, The Zionist Ideas, which I'm now trying to translate into Hebrew, with the Zionist salons, which I've done in Hebrew and in English, is to, sometimes people need to be invited in. Like the Jewish people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, needed to be invited in from the misery of their suffering to dream new things. I think what we need to do in Israel today is we need to, from a lot of the richness of what we do every day, understand, wow, there's a miracle going on. When I am now allowed to jog beyond my 100 meters, and I jog on the Parka Mesilah, the train tracks, and I pass Jews and Arabs all huffing and puffing in what I call the Republic of Sport and Suffering, we're living the Zionist ideas. If you notice the quotes that I took quotes of people from Israel and from abroad. I took quotes of people who are alive, people who are dead. I took quotes of people who are religious and who are, I don't like to call them secular because they have deep spiritual souls. And so I think we have to go back to one of the words that Rav Kook used, an ensemble, a chorus, a medley going on right in front of our own noses. But sometimes we're so busy arguing about Bibi versus Gantz. We're so busy arguing about the Palestinian conflict. We're so busy arguing about the Kotel that we don't see it. One of the things I love, and I think this is actually one of the things that Adam, you guys are doing so well also, is when I'm able to see Israel through the eyes of a foreigner. I'm very involved with Birthright. And when I see Israel through the eyes of a newcomer, then I get to see the dimensionality. Too many of our rabbis these days will talk about the Kotel only in terms of the women on the wall, whether they're for or against in the fight.
Right.
I know, I've done this. I've checked the studies with Len Sachs. When most Birthright participants come to the Kotel, they could have as many tattoos as they want. They could have as many earrings as they please. But the overwhelming majority see the Kotel through the lens of Jewish history, through the lens of the Zionist ideas, through the lens of community, sanctity, autonomy. And they report that it's not only the highlight of their trip, but it's the highlight of their spiritual lives. So it's out there. And one of the missions that I've taken on myself, I'm obviously not succeeding in, is naming it. Saying to everybody, look beyond the headlines, look beyond the crisis to the amazing things. And by the way, to touch on Corona, look what we've just seen. We've seen Israel society at work, Israel culture at work, Israel leadership at work in a way that really kept the numbers down of deaths and kept the social morale high. I only wish we could also solve the problem of those so many people who were suffering economically.
I completely agree with you about what you said in terms of how people react to the Kotel for the very first time. It's not something that usually repeats itself as well. It's usually something that you only experience one time. And it's usually because of the awe of it. But I wasn't on Birthright, but I was on the March to the Living. And when I was 18, I'll never forget the description that I gave to my parents after being at the Kotel for the first time. And I said, Mom, do you remember that George Burns movie, Oh God?
Uh-huh.
And she goes, yeah, why? I was like, well, it was like George Burns was standing right next to me. Like that was like the easiest way for me to describe it. Never had that feeling, had that feeling in different moments of my life post that first Kotel experience. One time it was in Arizona. There were a couple of times in Israel doing different things in different places. Definitely when I was inducted into the army, for sure, I had that feeling. Had it 3 Shabbats ago when we came up with our new campaign that we're going to be launching about doing Kiddush. But it's a very real thing that does get bogged down by the headlines that people don't understand that, there even though the area, the country, and Zionism can be shrouded in political difficulty in terms of its understanding, it's rooted in such a deep spiritual essence that gets very overlooked. And it was something that wasn't overlooked by Ahad Ha'am, I think, because that was kind of his essence. And you quoted, when you were talking about Cook and the song of the self, it made me think, and we have some questions and I'm going to go back to them, but it made me think specifically of my favorite article that Ahad Ha'am wrote, which was The Flesh and the Spirit, Ruach and Basar. And there's this line that has always resonated with me since the moment I read it. And I quote it every once in a while, but I want to read it. And it says, "I live for the sake of the perpetuation and the happiness of the community to which I am a member." Okay, this translation is a little different, but it says, I die to make room for new individuals who will mold the community afresh and will not allow it to stagnate and remain forever in one position. When the individual loves the community as his own life, he strives after its happiness as though if it was his individual well-being. He finds satisfaction and no longer feels so keenly the bitterness of his individual existence.
Wow.
Because he knows for what he lives and suffers. And I'm not gonna lie, when I read that the first time, my life changed. It really did allow me to kind of really wear the lenses of Jewish history and Zionist history, but it touches upon that exact same thing that you're talking about. There is like the importance of the self, but there's also the importance of being the member of the community, and you can't really have one without the other, because your individual self are part of a community, and you define yourself as a part of the community in which you do belong. My grandfather always used to say to me, "I'll let you know who you are when you introduce me to your friends."
Yeah.
He used to love to say that to me all the time. "You show me who you are. I'll tell you who you are when you show me your friends," is how he used to say it. And I definitely think that had to do with growing up during the Depression in the 1930s and really being on the streets with a lot of the other Jewish children at the time in Chicago. He was very close to his, group of people until he died. They all grew up together, and their community was what made them who they are. And I think that is a major thing that people are probably longing for and missing right now. And it's very difficult. We've gone from a community that even our house of worship is called the place of gathering, and there are a lot of people who are having trouble not doing minyan right now. My synagogue in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up, they're doing all of their services digitally on Zoom now. It's absolutely fascinating. I've been following it. It's very cool. They do morning mincha. Oh my God. They do morning shacharit, afternoon mincha, because they're the only conservative synagogue that does a daily minyan. So they're doing them on Zoom now. And I've been looking at their numbers, and they always have about 10, 15 people on them. And it's very unique in my opinion. I want to go back to the questions. I'm sorry for that little tangent, but you struck a chord in me when you were talking about so many things. It made me think of Ahad Ha'am. And we, of course, have to get back to isolation with Sharansky. First, I made a mistake. It was Michal, not Michael, from our last question. I apologize. But this is actually from a Michael. This is from Michael Hilkowitz in Rishon LeZion. He asked a question on our last talk. How do we get our friends on the left or the right to see Israel through the other lens? How do we get them to question their own view?
That's a great question. Thank you. Look,
it's a great question.
Right. So part of it is, one of the things we found that's most successful is simply hosting them, right? There's the power of birthright and the power of Masa and the power of the extraordinary revolution in the last 20 years, where 20 years ago, barely 22% of American Jews would have visited Israel. And at this point, and pre-corona numbers where more than 50% had visited Israel. The simple fact of coming to Israel, seeing the dimensionality for Jews and non-Jews is revolutionary, because, and here actually all the lies and all the negativity helps us, because they come all pinned. They come ready to see terrorists blowing up on every corner and tanks in every other corner. And all of a sudden it's quiet. All of a sudden it's relaxed. All of a sudden you feel Shabbat not just on Shabbat, but on Friday afternoon, even in secular Tel Aviv, where things slow down. That poetry. So first of all, and obviously this isn't the perfect formula for right now, is coming. Second is people like you, Michael and Michal, people who just tell their story. One of the things that I've noticed is in the 13 years that my family and I have lived in Israel, we came on sabbatical and never quite left. When there's a crisis, we get emails from friends saying, "Are you okay?" That we humanize. We become the bridge builders. And of course, that's so much of what One of the Vine and all of your good initiatives, Adam, are part of too. So, I would be more despairing if I had felt we had given it the good fight and it wasn't working. But when I look at how insane the left is when they talk about Israel and go from, oh, I dislike this policy or I dislike this prime minister, to therefore I give up on Israel. And how insane the right is when they talk about Israel, which is Israel's right or wrong, which Israel's perfect, how dare you criticize? And I'm suffocating from the extremes of the both. And again, it's reduced to the 120 or 240 characters on Twitter. I go, we haven't given it a good shot. I don't think what I'm saying is all that revolutionary or all that fresh. But the fact that so many people hear my talk about Zionist ideas and identity Zionism and go, wow, I haven't thought about that before, says to me that we're not doing our job. We're not celebrating Israel. We're not halkanizing Israel. We're not talking about the miracle because we're so stuck in the trenches. So free yourselves. And again, the power is that this becomes a model, not just for the kind of conversation we need about Israel and Zionism. It's the conversation we need about America too. Not every conversation should be about Trump, pro or con. Not every conversation these days should be about Corona. We've got to free ourselves, and we're searching for it, we're yearning for it. So we've got to do a better job. And I'm convinced, I've seen it. I've seen it in people's eyes when I did over 200 Zionist salons. And I was very clear, I'm not talking BB, BDS Palestinians. And I said, look, I'm not afraid of any of those questions. We can get to that afterwards. But I invited people in, left, right, religious, non-religious, mostly Jews, but also I did with non-Jews, Israelis, non-Israelis. I said, let's have a conversation about these powerful ideas. How can you not listen to that passage that Adam just quoted without getting a little kick in your patriotic adrenals? How can you not just get a little excited? If you open up the conversation in that way, and then you get to the headaches, you got success. We always start with the headaches, and then by the time we get to the other thing, we look ridiculous and defensive. So let's flip things around. Start with the core ideas, start with the core ideals, start with the core values, and we got a great story to tell.
I love the way you put that. It's so true. I have one final question, and then we'll go to some of my questions, and we'll continue for as long as you would like. It's from Bob Schloss, if I pronounced that correctly. I earlier read Michael instead of Michal, so I'm still blushing here with embarrassment. Which Mizrahi high-profile leaders are speaking out for Israeli liberal nationalism?
It's a very good question. Look, first of all, I gave you one. Erez Biton is an extraordinary voice, winner of the Israel Prize, but to his credit and to the credit of Naftali Bennett. So one, Ashkenazi, one Mizrahi, Bennett more from the right, Biton, while coming from the Mizrahi community, is from the left. They worked together on a really important initiative to update the Israeli curriculum to bring in more Mizrahi voices, and not do it in a way that was simply kind of heavy-handed tokenism, but do it in a way that brought the authentic conversation alive. And one of the things that I did in the Zionist Ideas is that it's based on a book from 1959 called The Zionist Idea. And The Zionist Idea, which is an extraordinary book by Arthur Hertzberg, and it was kind of the Bible for us in the Zionist youth movements of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And for all its strengths, and it had a Chana Am, and it had A.D. Gordon, it had Theodor Herzl, is it didn't have any women, not one, not Henrietta Zold, and not the poetess Rachel, and not Golda Meir, and adding them is an affirmative action. It's just basic justice and accuracy. And it also didn't have a lot of the Mizrahi voices. And one of the things that I found was how exciting and how rich the Mizrahi conversation is about Zionism. And let me go in three different directions. So one is that whereas Eastern European Zionism and Western European Zionism, but the heart of it was really the Eastern. It was they had Western European leaders like Herzl, but it was really a movement of the masses. Was a little bit forced in that it was a revolution. It was a rebellion. It was against. And one of the phrases that we talk about when we talk about Mizrahi Zionism is they were born Zionist. That their rabbis were less likely to say, oh, just wait for the Mashiach. The lay people were less oppressed often because the rabbis, even the most religious rabbis, tended to be a little less heavy-handed. And so they did their Zionism together, not in opposition. So that's why it's a more sort of natural, authentic Zionism. It's a less forced Zionism, and that's a historic model. Second,
it's probably the reason why we eat kidney now on Pesach.
Yeah, exactly right. It's more fun also, but that's a whole other. We'll talk about that in group therapy later. There's an extraordinary text that I have from Rav Uziel, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi, of Israel. And he's most famous for co-authoring with Rav Herzog, Isaac Herzog, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, the prayer of the state of Israel, with a little bit of an assist, Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the first flowering of our redemption, from this Nobel Prize winner named Shai Agnon. But Rav Uziel, and when I say Rav Uziel, imagine him in, traditional Sephardic rabbinic garb. So he looks like a creature from the Middle Ages, if I can caricature. When he writes about nationalism, in one hand, sounding like a political science student, talking about the power of creating states and the power of the nation state. But he also echoes biblical language. And that's a kind of integration and synthesis that you hear in the Mizrahi voice. And to go to the contemporary world, there's a very exciting thinker named Meir Buzaglo, who talks about, I'm a Masorti, I'm a traditionalist. He has a beautiful Ani Ma'amin about his traditionalism. It didn't quite fit into the Zionist idea, but he speaks as a proud Mizrahi, who has criticisms, by the way, of which we all should have, of the way the Mizrahim were treated and often abused when they first arrived in the country. He's the one, by the way, who taught me that even that word Mizrahi, which is now the politically correct term for Sephardi, actually is an artificial term imposed only on the Moroccans and the Libyans and the Syrian Jews when they came to Israel and were no longer looked at as being part of the Iraqi Jewish community or the Moroccan Jewish community or the Egyptian Jewish community, but this Eastern Jewish community, the Mizrahi. So it's still a kind of an Ashkenazi-dominated Ben Gurionist approach, but we use the word nevertheless. And when he talks about the power of tradition, it's again this kind of bridge building. You see, what I'm trying to do is invite us away from the world of punchlines, invite us away from the world of extremists to a multidimensional, a three-dimensional world, a world of tugs, of powers, of back and forth. And so he talks about tradition. He inherited it, he preserves it, but also he renews it. And he redefines it. He comes from tradition and he's rooted in his past, but he's also looking to the future. And that's the kind of dynamic that we need. And we need to hear more of it. And
I'd like to ask you something about that, actually. Do you feel that, I made the joke about the kidney. Do you ever feel that, I think we spoke about this one Passover, you and I, a long time ago, and I know that you wrote an article, you're not religious, you're traditional, or something like that. And that, do you feel that we're in this space right now where we should be adapting new halachot and reinterpreting old halachot in a way because of sovereignty, which you spoke greatly on, which is like, we could do a whole nother topic just on the idea of Jews and sovereignty. I mean, many articles have been written about it. But that is a huge part of what the Zionist movement was supposed to do for Israelis or modern day Jews. And I very much, being here, living in Israel, you kind of experience that, but it's not something that has gotten really to the diaspora. I would have to venture a guess to say this has got to be one of the main things that could actually enhance, the diaspora-Israel relationship, so to speak, because we aren't in this mutual conversation of reinterpreting our tradition for the modern day age. And Corona, at the very least, is allowing us to begin that conversation with how many rabbis, well, actually the Ashkenazi one said no, and the Mizrahi one said yes, Zooming for Pesach because of Corona. I mean, there is a I feel like there is almost a fear amongst the rabbinic elite right now to make the changes that are necessary that will allow the next generation to be able to connect to their tradition on their own terms without watering it down.
So let me answer that very important question, both from the highest heights and from the texture of daily life. So from the highest heights, great thinkers like Rabbi David Hartman, like Eliezer Berkovitz, like Beni Ish Shalom, all of whom are within the Orthodox tradition, talked about this. Beni Ish Shalom, and they all appear in my Zionist Studies book. Beni Ish Shalom has this wonderful essay called The Theology of Sovereignty. Exactly that. Eliezer Berkovitz talks about the fact that, wait a minute, so much of the halacha, so much of Jewish law was created in the galut. We need to update it. Yitz Greenberg has a beautiful way of putting it. He says it almost in accounting terms. And right now we're in the middle of the Omer, right? He says, look what happened during the course of the galut. As Jews were miserable, we added more days of mourning, more days of lost, more fast days. And then what happens? Yom Yerushalayim, Yom Hatzmaut. I went out of order, right? We need to add more days, really like in the accounting of the Jewish calendar, more celebratory days. So all these great thinkers are actually saying what you're saying, which is, yeah, we've got to update. And I'll give you my own Zoom story, which is that, unfortunately, at the beginning of March, I lost my mother. And so I've been saying minyan, I've been saying Kaddish 3 times a day in an Orthodox minyan on Zoom, thanks to Rav Benny Lau and Rav Eliezer Melamed. Rav Eliezer Melamed is one of the great halachic authorities of today, and they basically said, okay, you can do a Zoom minyan. You don't repeat the Amida. You don't. There are certain things you don't do to acknowledge the fact that it's still different, but you do enough to be able to have that powerful communal experience. So some of that is happening at the highest heights. And in the texture, Kitniot is a great example. There are many of us who grew up in, don't eat legumes on Pesach, but we came here and we said, wait a minute, this is a Sephardi majority. Wait a minute, you're on the streets and you have kids and they have all these, Passover buns, and you're going to start saying which is kosher and which isn't kosher. And that halakha itself, that it's not halakha, that minhag, that custom is so primitive and so medieval anyway. So we need to start updating, we need to start renewing. And every day, and certainly every Shabbat in my neighborhood, in southern Jerusalem, we have all kinds of innovations, Shira Hadashah, Shir Chadash, on the question of women. And that, by the way, is a beautiful model of Israel-diaspora relations, because you take something like feminism, which is in many ways a Western import, an American import, but also point out an American Jewish import. If we look at Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, so many of the key thinkers in the feminist revolution who were Jewish, you bring it to Jerusalem, you reify it through the lens and through the tradition of Judaism. And now we have all kinds of minyanim. In my neighborhood, go a kilometer each way, and you'll find so many different attempts to make sure that modern women have some kind of voice, some kind of respect, but also tradition. And some of my neighbors say, I want to be equal. Some of them say, I want to equal, and that means having the exact same responsibilities. Others say, no, I want to keep my tradition. But the conversation is happening. And where's it happening? Right here in my neighborhood, right here in Israeli soil. So the texture is occurring. And of course, go to someone like Rav Goren, who was the key guy, Shlomo Goren, in creating a whole new set of halachot for the army. What do you do vis-a-vis death? What do you do vis-a-vis eating? What do you do vis-a-vis Pesach? What do you do vis-a-vis defending the country, even on Shabbat? And so it's happening, but you're right, it needs to happen more, and it needs to happen outside in the light, not secretly behind.
No, I mean, like, I remember my very first Shavuot in Jerusalem. I ended up doing a night of learning at the conservative yeshiva. And I got, as usual, I got into an argument with somebody where they said, and I thought this was very typical American, nothing against the Americans, but I thought it was a very American interpretation, where it was, and they used the word Judaism, which obviously we've had this conversation. I don't like that word. I think it's a Gentile word that was used to explain how Jews lived their lives in Spain and during the medieval time, because that's when the term kind of appeared. But he said, Judaism is a framework on how to be a good person. And I looked at him and I was like, I said to him, what are you talking about? I go, Rabbinic Judaism was put in place as a framework to keep the community together during exile and dispersion. I go, now that we've returned, no one's asking the question, do we restart? Do we look at everything from scratch again? Because everything was made in the in-between period of the Second Commonwealth and the Third Commonwealth. And it was meant to keep the community as closely together as they possibly could through laws and regulations. And I do think it's something that many modern Israelis very much want, because listen, there is I think we're getting a tiny bit off topic, but I mean, like, this does really have to do with the I and the we. There is a major spiritual crisis amongst Jews today because they feel alienated. And there is a representation of what Judaism is in Israel versus what it is in the diaspora, when in reality, there really needs to be a marriage of the two, in my opinion, because modern day Israelis are modern day liberals. And people don't really realize that in the diaspora. I would say Israelis are just as liberal as the majority of the Democrats in the United States, except on the Israel issue, so to speak. And one of the things that I think that could really greatly help the relationship between the diaspora and Israel, but not only that, create a spiritual revolution for the self is to have not a new interpretation of Jewish thought or law or halacha, but the convening of great minds to begin to say, okay, things are different now. The world has changed. The internet exists. Transcontinental flights are possible. Things are different. I remember reading 5 years ago in the Jerusalem Post that the big epidemic in Gush Etzion was the texting epidemic on Shabbat, because children from religious families are arguing that texting doesn't break Shabbat. It's really fascinating, and there are, in my opinion, there are major questions that need to be asked and answered in order for the next generation to have an authentic connection to their history.
I'm going to sidestep the complicated question you raise. It's important, but just too complex for this, about who decides and how you decide. But so rather than go top down, let me go bottom up. And let me talk about two institutions I know very, very intimately. One, Birthright, and the second, increasingly, I'm learning more and more about the Army as my kids spend more and more time there. So Birthright is a beautiful example of what you're talking about, because in Birthright, most participants who come from abroad come from the world of nothing. I mean, they're really like they're the generation. Not only they're not the rebels, the Rasha. They're not the Tom, the simple. They're really the Sheino Yodei Lishol. They don't know how to ask the basic questions. The classic story of that is when Birthright was first announced, and this goes back even 20 years. And it's only gotten worse. And they said, Birthright Israel for a free trip. And it was in September, October. They said, Shana Tova, Birthright Israel for a free trip. Please email this, birthrightisrael@israel.com. And they got a lot of emails back. Dear Mr. Tova, thank you for the offer. That's the level of ignorance and they come to Israel.
But it's not their fault.
No, it's not their fault. They come to Israel and they see an excitement. They see a dynamism. And every Birthright has the Mifgash program with the Israelis built into it. And what do the Israelis see from the Americans? The Israelis see often these cool, hip American Jews who sing the Birkat because they learned at a camp, who are not religious, but still have a kind of connection to Jerusalem, to Judaism. So there's a bridging that goes on back and forth that nobody talks about. That's really dynamic. That's really exciting. And both my sons are now in the Army, and they have had many, 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 many more experiences that are positive, of commanders being sensitive to their need, because they're both quite religious, their need to pray, of having an exciting Karabachian Friday night dinner experience, and all kinds of Chiloni kids, all kinds of secular kids coming and joining. They were all in the Army for Seder, which is why we only had a Seder of 3, and they told stories of some secular kids saying, I'd never seen this before. They knew Manish Tanah, but they'd never seen the dimensionality of it. So I think there are all kinds of bridge building things that are occurring that don't make the headlines.
No, I completely agree. And I have to add, I think one of the biggest misconceptions because of the Haredi issue, probably in the diaspora, is that you can't live an observant life as a soldier. And I have to say, when I was in the Army, it was the only time in my life I prayed every day, 3 times a day, other than a short period of time in my 20s. It was the first time every day for 6 months I had tefillin on, no mistakes. You know, it was the first, I mean, I had a lot of firsts in my religious experiences as a soldier. And to me, that was one of the things that made my Army experience as wonderful as it was, you know, to be completely honest.
And by the way, if we go back to, I think it was Robert's question about Mizrahim, I love to get up in front of Orthodox synagogues back when we had a circuit to go on in Beverly Hills or in Brooklyn, or else we say, I love intermarriage. And they stop and I say, the more intermarriage we have between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, the more we see these old line Tel Avivi, quote unquote, secular families marry into Mizrahi families, which are, they were just born Zionists, but they're also born traditional.
Right.
And they, you know what? We can have Friday night dinner and still go to the soccer game on Shabbat afternoon. We can have Friday night dinner and still be the liberals that you're talking about. We can have tradition, Masoret, right? We talked about that, and also still have the autonomy, the eye that we need. So the old line Tel Avivi, who used to have the sandwich, the pork sandwich on Yom Kippur or on Pesach, which, by the way, shows a literacy and a rebelliousness and an insiderness, which is also worth talking about in group therapy, is gone because more and more they're a part of a Mizrahi family or a Mizrahi clan or have some Mizrahi.
I love the line.
Say, hey, we're a part of this.
I love the line, Ashkenazim fear God. Mizrahim are friends with him.
Yeah.
And I learned that when I was in the Army. I want to, you're going to see me get up and plug my computer in a second. So I want to ask this question, and I'll turn my video off while you answer it, and I'll come back on. I want to talk a little bit about Sharansky and the work that you've done with him, because it's so prevalent to this discussion today. He was just in the news for donating his Genesis Prize for COVID research. Obviously, your book is coming out quite soon. I have dibs on hosting that release party in Jerusalem for you. But he spent so much time in isolation. One of the most meaningful things that I saw published at the start of this was his 5 tips for isolation. After I read that, a lot of the discussions that I had with people changed, because I realized this is what prisons do to prisoners to make them crack. This is what people do to really get to you, so to speak. And he survived it in a way that many, many people have not. And, he not only was my hero growing up and who, when I was in college, I, really looked up to and read his work, and his story was extremely inspiring to many Jews of my generation, because we were born right after the Soviet Jews were allowed to leave. So his story was very well known to us growing up. Is there anything that you could share from your time working with him? You've worked with him on 2 books. He wrote the foreword for Zionist Ideas. You worked on this biography now. I would assume that there are many great lessons from such a great man that lived through something so much worse than this.
Absolutely. First of all, the cliche is that when you have a hero and you get to see him or her up close, you're disappointed. And I can really say honestly that we've been working together on this new book, which you can pre-order on Amazon, intimately, almost daily for 3 years. And I can say that if anything, rather than being disappointed by him or by Avital, I've walked away so humbled. First of all, so privileged to have the opportunity to befriend each of them and learn from them and have our families meet and bond and break bread together. But they're the real deal. The more I learn about them, the more impressed I am by them, the more moved I am by them, the more inspired I am by them, the more they are truly, truly the real deal. It's extraordinary. So it's been an amazing adventure. It's been a great journey. And you're absolutely right. He survived because he realized that they could control his body, but only he could control his soul. they could control the conditions around him, but that didn't mean that he wasn't free. And he was free because, and he tells, these amazing stories about the KGB interrogators making fun of him and saying, oh, you're not only forgotten and abandoned, but you're not free, we control you. And then he would tell some anti-Soviet joke or some joke about Leonid Brezhnev, who was the doddering, senile Soviet leader at the time. And he says, look, I can laugh, you can't. Who's free? So there is this guy is in prison. He's in the gulag. He's being pummeled, and yet he's figuring out how to torture his torturers. And it's very funny. He doesn't use the word. He never refers to them as my tormentors, because they didn't get to him. They didn't torment him, and it really shows. He has a glint in his eye. And I've been privileged in my life to meet a couple of people like that. My father-in-law, who survived. He wasn't a survivor. He didn't like to use that word because he wasn't in Auschwitz. He was in Romania, but survived many close calls during the war. Someone like Judea Pearl, the father of Daniel Pearl. There are people who have a glint in their eye, who have a gleam in their soul, who just, you're not going to get them. You're not going to pummel them. You're not going to defeat them because there's something inside. And one of the things we try to do in the book is share some of that. And one of the things that Natan did so effectively was, indeed, as soon as this Corona thing started, he started giving his 5 tips about surviving isolation, because he's got not just the PhD but the postgraduate degree in this, and it's about realize what you can control and what you can't control. You can only control what you can control. He of course puts the whole thing in context, which is, and as you alluded to, they were trying to break him. All these limitations are trying to save us. Enjoy that. Embrace that. What a powerful thing.
It's a great point.
Sense of humor.
It's
keep laughing.
Right.
A sense of purpose. Understand that by doing what you're doing, you may not have Corona, right? But you're also protecting others. So we're part of a big, even though you're alone, you're together. We're part of a big struggle for health and for safety and for one another. I may have immunity, but I have to worry about the 80 or 90 or 100-year-old person I might pass on the street. And this whole notion also of, so you've got a gift of time, use it. Make that project that you never had time to make. Build that idea, learn that language, do something, keep the mind active to let the soul free. Because the physical dimensions that we live in are only a part of it.
It's beautiful. Well, Gil, I think this is a great note to wrap up on. I want to say thank you again for your time and your energy. I hope that we can do another one of these if you would like. They're absolutely fantastic. We love having you. I always enjoy speaking with you. I know you know that. I'm pretty sure everybody watching knows that. I would like to let everybody know that Gil's new book, Natan Sharansky, what is the title of it?
The book it's co-authored by him and me, and we've gone over every single word again and again and again. The book is called Never Alone, and as I said, it's available for pre-order on Amazon, and every pre-order is a vote for the Amazon buyers to buy multiple copies, so please help us out.
So please check out Gil's new book on Amazon, and if you'd like to support the Israel Innovation Fund and our webinars and our podcasts and the Wine on the Vine program and all of the other things that we do, the Hebrew Wallpaper Project, What If Studios, you can go to wineonthevine.org and you can plant a vine with your favorite winery or favorite charity. It's pretty easy. You choose a cause, you choose a winery. It's that simple. Gil, thank you so much for joining us again for this very important talk. Please send my love to your family and thank them for letting me borrow you for the last hour and a half. And I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody that joined us, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Adam. Keep it going.
Thank you.